Hello, everyone. I'm Louise Quentin, head of the Books and Ideas Office at the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in New York. I'm glad to see so many of you here today for this second event of our virtual series, Ideas and Ideals, Strong Female Voices, with a discussion today between Lauren Groff and Emmanuelle Bayamack-Tam, moderated by Cathy Waldman, about their books, both entitled Arcadia. I want to sincerely thank the three of them for accepting this invitation. This event was made possible through the support of the Institut Français and Emory University, who I also want to thank for their involvement. I also thank the wonderful teams of the Albertine Bookstore and Seven Stories Press. This discussion will last about 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute audience question and answer session. Please feel free to send us your question either rise in the Q&A section so that we can pass them on to the moderator. Before passing the mic to Cathy, who will introduce our guest speakers, I would like to take a moment to introduce her to you all. Cathy Waldman is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes about books, literature, and more. Previously, she was a staff writer at Slate and the host of the Slate's Audiobook Club podcast. She won the National Book Critics Cycle Nona Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing in 2019 and the American Society of Magazine Editors Award for Journalists Younger Than 30 in 2018. Lastly, a small technical note. So this discussion will be simultaneously interpreted in French and English. To choose your preferred language to listen in, you should click on the globe symbol in the lower right-hand corner of the Zoom display. Cathy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Louise, for that introduction. And before I get to my introductions, I just want to apologize for my atrocious French accent, but I'll do the best that I can. So Emmanuelle Bayamack-Tam has published 12 novels and 2 plays with POL, including 3 novels under the pseudonym Rebecca Ligieri. She is a founding member of the Interdisciplinary Association Autres et Pareils and co-director of Édition Contre-Pied. Arcadia won the Prix de Livre Enter. It was shortlisted for the Prix Femina, the Prix Medici, and the Prix de Fleur. Lauren Groff's novel, Fates and Furies, was a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award, and was a New York Times notable book and bestseller. Her short story collection, Florida, was a finalist for the National Book Award. She is the author of 6 books, including her most recent novel, Matrix, which comes out in August. Is that right, Lauren? August?
September.
Yes. September. Oh, I'm very excited for it. So I jumped it up a month, but September. Well, so with those out of the way, I'd love to just get the conversation started. Emmanuelle, I guess it would be great to start with you to give our listeners some background. Arcadia follows a naive but sharp-tongued narrator, Farah, as she grows up on a fictional commune in eastern France. She's surrounded by bewitching natural beauty and also deluded, hypocritical people. We first meet Farah as a 6-year-old girl, but over the course of the novel, she awakens into a more gender-fluid identity and begins to develop male physical features along with powerful sexual desires. And so, Emmanuelle, I wanted to ask you first, what made you want to write about an intersex character, and especially to make her the protagonist of a novel about utopian societies? Maybe if you saw a link between those 2 things.
Alors, bonjour à tous.
Hello to everyone. It's not the first time that I have an intersexuated character, or at least a character whose identity is trans. I've often, even since my first published novel in 1996, it was already the story of a boy who felt like a girl. So I always have characters who, in any case, defy assignations, defy categorization, often intersex characters, or whose ethnic backgrounds are extremely difficult to situate. So having that kind of characters who are like free electrons in the social spectrum, I have the impression I can ask more questions, push against norms more, push against the way things are done. And so I'm repeating, Farah is an intersex character. She's not the first in my novelistic lineup or the last, but I often have characters that are hard to situate, whether it's on the ethnic level or the gender one.
Lauren, your novel Arcadia also begins with an innocent child protagonist, and it traces his gradual disenchantment with the separatist society he's grown up in. What's interesting about Bit, who's the protagonist, is he appears to be a straight man, but he's gentler and more tender than the macho stereotype, and that's a defining piece of his personality. So I was wondering if you were working through any specific ideas about gender in the book.
I absolutely was working through ideas about gender. I think at the time that I was writing Arcadia, I was bringing sons into the world, little boys. And I believe American masculinity in particular is relatively poisonous. So I was thinking about a utopian ideal of what gender could possibly look like without some of the more pernicious pressures on what it might be to be a man in the society. I think there was a part of me that was trying to create a son that I wanted to have in the world. I wanted, a gentle, sensitive, lovely person. And so there was a lot of projection for sure. When we write books, often we don't even know.
Mais c'est bon maintenant.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I wonder, Emmanuelle, what you felt Farah's gender identity allowed her to see about the world, or perhaps what stereotypes she was able to shed.
Alors précisément, j'ai pas l'impression d'avoir mis en œuvre de stéréotypes, du moins j'espère.
Specifically, I don't have the impression of having put stereotypes in place, at least I hope not. My idea is that ultimately there's a continuum from femininity to masculinity, and that ultimately individuals are rarely at one extreme or the other of that spectrum. Katie, I don't know if that answers your question, but to be specific, I try to have characters who are not cliches or stereotypes or adhere to them, but who express something that is not conventional femininity or conventional masculinity.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you. I was asking more whether there was something about masculine or feminine stereotypes that you specifically wanted to reject through this character who sort of straddles the two roles.
Alors je suis désolée, là, j'essaie d'avoir.
So I'm sorry, I'm there, that's better. I'm trying to have less reflection in my face. So yes, to be specific, Farah, who at the beginning is biologically a girl, is going to discover that she has this symptom, the symptom of the Artinsky symptoms. She has exacerbated hair, muscles, her genitals are atrophied. So her body questions gender, and she's going to get into a sociological investigation to know, what does it mean to be a girl? What does it mean to be a boy? She's going to ask the people in her community, and realize that there's no satisfying answer. Farah is very well placed to question gender and to question anatomical sexual organs because it's very little, because she's not very gendered through her anatomy.
Thank you. Lauren, turning back to you, if you don't mind, you use a pretty close third person for Bit. And we understand him to be deeply sensitive and thoughtful, as if his imagination is responsible for much of the beauty on the page, which I should say is considerable. It's a beautifully written book. But Bit doesn't speak much, especially at the beginning. So I wondered whether you were trying to propose any particular relationship here between silence and goodness, or between secrecy and purity, since we are reading about these societies that kind of withdraw from the larger world in order to be less corrupted.
That's a brilliant question, and one I've never been asked about this book that's been out for a while now. So thank you, Katie. I wasn't actually trying to make any link between silence and goodness. I actually don't think that there is much. I mean, possibly in some situations, yes. I think that it was a psychological manifestation of living in a community where there was not a great deal of privacy, where things were happening that were terrifying for this child, and where there wasn't the kind of parental attention that possibly he desired and needed at the time. I mean, all children are different. Some kids don't want any, but Bit was a child who needed a lot, so he wasn't getting that. And I think part of it was possibly, not to psychologize like a 4-year-old, but just to see if he could bring to himself the love that he wanted by being silent, if people could notice. Yeah, I wasn't making a larger point. It was just a character aspect.
Yeah, although I mean it's really lovely too, because in a way he has parents who raise him. I mean, not just Abe and Hannah, obviously, but he filters so much of his experience through books, and he finds that Grimm's fairy tale book, and often the way he describes his life, he says Arcadia at one point is like holding a book with the binding is broken and there are pages missing. And so it's as if he does find sort of authorities to raise him, but they're people who communicate with him through language, which is also such a talent for him. So that was really interesting. Emmanuelle, Farah also spends a lot of time in the library, but she doesn't seem to find the answers that she's looking for in any of those books. Sorry, that was an open-ended question. If you wanted to talk about the role of transmitted knowledge or books in your book.
Alors, avec le personnage de Farah.
So with the character of Farah, who very young arrives in this community when she's 6 years old, I really tried to give her what, in my sense, is an ideal education. She grows up in nature with no technology, with available to her an entire library in which she can take books at leisure because she has no other distraction. There's no internet, no smartphone. And additionally, which is close to what Lauren was saying, she's not dependent on her parents alone. They're there, but there are other adults around her. She's raised by a community. And so it seems to me that we avoid what can be a kind of toxic face-to-face between the child and the parents. Ultimately here, there are a lot of adults here taking care of Farah. As for books, it's true that very often I have characters, children's characters or teenage readers. It's my way of writing speculative novels. my way of writing speculative novels is not to represent the writer. That doesn't interest me at all, telling stories about people writing, but instead to represent a child or a teenager who is diving into the activity of reading, which for me was a foundational activity, the activity of reading.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the natural beauty that that comprises part of this ideal education, and I was struck by the very rapturous descriptions of the natural world in your book. I wanted to ask too if you saw a connection between that very lyrical, abundant style and the theme of your book.
Alors, comment dire?
How can I put this? My ambition from the start with Arcadia was to write a novel that was bucolic, because ultimately I have deep anxieties, which I think are universally shared, which are environmental anxieties and fears. I think that today we are experiencing a crisis similar to the one that Europeans must have lived during the first industrial revolution, where we feel that the link with nature is being torn. And that led to the literature of romanticism. And I feel that we write better about nature because we feel that that link with nature is being stressed. That was the starting point for Arcadia. As for lyricism, that's my way of writing, which is to say that I write in a way that is exuberant, with ample sentences, sometimes very complex, with an abundance of images. So that can even give a saturation effect. The lyricism was not specific to this subject. I think it's recurrent in everything I write.
Lauren, I was struck because you also write so beautifully about the natural world, but your lyricism about nature seemed very humanistic to me, in that a lot of your figures compare sort of lovely sights in nature to humans. So we have trees that are like women washing their hair. There are several instances like that. And so I wonder if you could talk about this particular form of, because I know you're very environmentally concerned and conscious, but that form of elevating nature by sort of fusing it with like a more human spirit.
Yes, I can absolutely talk about that. And I just want to say that it's funny hearing Emmanuelle speak, because I think that we came from the same places to write our very different books. And it's just a testament to how different authors process the world profoundly differently, and it's kind of beautiful. We both have this understanding of romanticism and the romantic world, and the way that we romanticize nature. And in Arcadia, my Arcadia, they're both Arcadias, but in my Arcadia, Bits and all of his Arcadians, they're humanists. I mean, that is the way that they see the world, and not necessarily that they put humans at the center of the world, but they care very deeply, mostly about the other people in the community, right? So the community is the core and the heart of what they're trying to do, and in some ways, the community is bigger in each person than the other individual people, right? So like the collective is more important than the individual. And I think probably through my research about 1960s, 70s, 80s utopianist communes that happened in the United States of America, that I just started to see the same sort of refrains happening over and over again. It is turning nature into human attributes, right? The trees of the hair, things like that. I just, it's one of those flavor things that I kept finding in these books, and I think I imported it in Arcadia, and then it's sort of risen out of Arcadia and it's sort of infected all my other books too. But it became, what is it called? The pathetic fallacy. I mean, that's a negative term for it. But finding ways in which to personify nature, if that brings you closer to the nature, if that makes you more likely to defend and love and try to protect the world, then I'm all for it. I'm all for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not one-sided, right? Because you also have humans who are, named after natural phenomena, even if that's like a little bit wry, the way you sometimes gently poke fun of like hippie names. But it is really that sort of value of, I think, I'm not sure if Hardy puts it this way, I can't remember who does, but living with the land as opposed to on the land. It's like the two, sort of going back to intersexuality, the two categories of human and nature start to blur and blend a little bit. I also actually just want to take a moment to invite you two to sort of ping off each other and respond directly to each other without me just like blah, blah, blah in the middle. So Emmanuelle, if you have any responses to what Lauren's saying, please feel free.
Non, effectivement.
No, indeed, by reading Arcadia, Lauren's Arcadia, I had a rather sensorial experience. Every time it was a question of nature, of the season, of swimming, I experienced a kind of, yes, a sensorial jubilation through reading, which ultimately echoed what I had experienced in writing my Arcadia. Though I wrote it in winter, in all the passages in which I described the moments where Farah is climbing trees and sees cats, hens, etc. These were precious moments for me. And I re-experienced that reading Lauren's book. These moments of escape, immersion in a nature that is not wild nature. It's a humanized nature, but it's a form of nature.
Yeah, your book is so funny and so full of just joie de vivre, right? It's just it's just bursting with vitality and life. And I could tell that you were having fun writing it. It was just very obvious that it was a joyous experience, at least from the reader's point of view.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing that I loved about the experience of reading that book is Farah's sense of humor, which I think actually gets to the other piece of this puzzle, which is how Farah engages with humans around her, not just with the natural world. And I found that to be very different. She seems quite acerbic at times. She's often pretty disgusted by the way not only her elders act, how they behave, but also how they look. And I wanted to ask you sort of about that contempt that comes out and sort of what role it was playing for you.
Alors, concernant les adultes,
concerning the adults and the bodies that are sometimes damaged or ungraceful or falling apart that Farah describes, I don't at all agree that there is contempt or scorn. In any case, my writing, when I describe these bodies that indeed are somehow outside the norms, are not immediately desirable in any case, my writing tries to be well-meaning and full of desire. Now, Farah, it's true that when she describes Victor, who's quite large, and Dada, who's very old, it's possible that a reader might feel repulsion, but that's not at all what I'm trying to do in writing the book. As for the character of Arcadie, who is 50, who's got something of a belly, not necessarily very handsome. I tried to make him desirable. And one of the ideas that is throughout the novel Arcadia is that anybody, however much it might be ungraceful, can create desire. At least that's the idea I have in life and that I'm trying to get down on paper. But visibly, not every reader has that feeling.
Yeah, I think it's maybe it's a translation thing, but when there are descriptions such as hideous lips and sort of Dada, it says that she is the living proof of the ineffectiveness of makeup. So those descriptions do have value judgments attached to them. It's not just we're seeing large lips or slimy lips even.
Oui, la lectrice.
Yes, the reader. Just a small thing. Farah, my narrator, she's also has the radicality, the radicalness, and of her very young age. As for Dada, who's very old, what she doesn't like about Dada is that she uses plastic surgery. It's not that she's getting old that repulses her. It's all the artifices that she uses. And then it's true, now I'm starting to remember, Victor, I describe him as quite repulsive. But if you think of it through the eyes of a very radical young person.
Yeah.
Also, children are relentless. I have 2 small children, and they are so cruel about my physicality, right? And I should be beautiful to them because I'm their mother. So I do think that young people tend to be very judgmental often about people's appearances. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I think it's not unrelated to the theme of utopia, in that so often when we're trying to attain this kind of spiritual perfection, that manifests in sort of discomfort with the body, with the physical or sensual.
Oui. Je sais pas, Cathy.
Yes, I don't know, Katie, who are you addressing this statement to?
Oh, either of you. Yeah.
I do think one needs to be able to understand the ills of the world and the uglinesses and the things against which one is acting in order to create or to try to create something more beautiful, something utopian, right? That this is not only in terms of the communities that both Emmanuelle and I are talking about. Both groups have profoundly dissected and diagnosed a lot of the evils of their societies, and they're pushing against that, right? It's very oppositional. But at the same time, also, when one writes, one is not only writing toward something, some idea. Well, at least I am. I'm always writing against other things as well. I'm always writing oppositionally in order to sort of discover the boundaries of what I know and what the world is, and you can only palpate those things by sort of figuring out where the faults are, where the ugliness is, right? So I think you're right. I think it's profoundly linked. This hypersensitivity to ugliness, I think it's profoundly linked to the utopian impulse.
Yeah. That makes me curious about what specifically you felt you were writing against in this book.
Oh, the instigating thing was I wasn't sure if it was a moral thing to bring children into a world full of climate change where it's possible that my kids will see the end of humanity, right? So is that was an ethical choice that I saw people all around me making easily and happily, and one that I really struggled with. So I was trying very hard to push against, the feelings of doom, that sort of beset us at 2 a.m. every single night, or I was trying to discover if there's nobility in just trying, right? Just doing our best and attempting anyway. So that, I think that's what I was pushing, is the state of the world.
When we talk about these broader political and environmental contexts, I'm also struck by the role that the refugee crisis plays, Emmanuelle, in your novel. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Bien sûr.
Of course.
Alors, j'ai situé mon roman.
I located my novel on the border between France and Italy. For those who know it, for those who know the area, I put my community near Menton, which is really very close to the border. That's a place in France where the migratory crisis is crystallizing because there are a great number of refugees who arrive in Vintimille in Italy nearby, who try to come into France, who get pushed back 1, 2, 10 times, who try to get in through the mountains, who sometimes get lost, sometimes drown, don't have the right equipment, so they freeze. It's a place that is both very beautiful, very privileged, very rich, and where ultimately this extreme poverty is arriving. So obviously, I imagine that my little community of utopians, idealists, well-meaning people, tolerant, libertines, they would be confronted with that reality of immigration. So in the community that I imagined, a refugee arrives, an Eritrean, a young man. He expects that he's going to be welcomed. He should be, given the local ideology, and yet ultimately he's going to be cast out because in this community, they're very tolerant, they're very welcoming, but their tolerance and their sense of hospitality has limits. So I imagined a community as a kind of microcosm that represented on a small scale the way that we in France and in Europe are welcoming refugees. In other words, we're not welcoming them. We kind of stay amongst ourselves, and the welcome that they receive in France is truly shameful. So my community was a microcosm, a way of showing the welcome policy for refugees in France.
Thank you. It reminds me of that quote that my utopia is always someone else's dystopia, which also seemed to come into play for both of these novels.
Very accurate, yes.
I wanted to ask too a little bit about the structure, the form of these two books. Lauren, you chose to write a discontinuous narrative. So it's broken into 4 parts. We see Bit at 5, we see him as a teenager, and then at 35, once he's left his Arcadia, and then finally at 50 in this, again, dystopian, or against a dystopian backdrop, a plague. So I wanted to ask you what drew you to that type of storytelling here.
Sure. When I was thinking about this book, I modeled some of the structure on one of my favorite works of art, which is Paradise Lost by John Milton, which I know it's a 3-part structure, but I sort of wanted to not follow it directly, but to sort of think about what paradise is, and if you can, have it, lose it, possibly regain it, maybe not. It's just having an unstable paradise lost was my structural component. And I'm so sorry for those of you who are trying to listen. My internet is unstable right now. Please forgive me.
Emmanuelle, I hope I'm not misremembering, but it seemed that your story unspools in a more or less linear fashion. There aren't big gaps. I mean, she's a child and then she becomes older, but it did seem like we were staying with her for most of her coming of age. And I wonder if that was an intentional decision.
Vous avez tout à fait raison.
You're absolutely right. It's a linear narrative. We meet Farah when she's 6 and we leave her when she's at the dawn of her adult life. She's about 20. I don't always write like that. I have some books that are less linear, but it's true that I really like here, I wanted to really grasp and record her years of growing, of learning, adolescence, also years of metamorphosis. I always said that every book could be called Metamorphosis or The Metamorphoses, whether it's Kafka or Ovid. I like to grasp these moments of development, transformation, evolution, physical transformation that could be on the edge of the monstrous, in any case, in the case of Farah. But to tell these years of development is something that really interests me.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's definitely a sexual awakening too. And I felt like with both of these books, sex played such an interesting part. Not only in kind of highlighting when we should start being suspicious of a character, like the cult leader, which I do want to ask you both about, but also sort of questioning in a perfect society, what should sex be like? Who should sex be between? What limits, if any, should we place on sexuality? So if either of you had any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them.
Absolutely. I want to say that the idea that every book could be titled The Metamorphosis is brilliant. I've never heard this before, but it's absolutely true, or Metamorphosis. But also, a lot of what happens in my Arcadia comes out of my research. And when I was doing research about utopian communities, it did seem as though sex was the thing that always broke them. Right? Sex and sort of codifying sexual relationships between the members of the community. And then you look at long-standing abbeys and convents where sex is basically taken out of the equation, and they are sort of utopian, and they kind of work. They work much better. So my thought with this is that sex is something that you cannot gauge, right? You can't plan for in your laws for your communities, right? It's just it's the great disruptor. It comes in and it changes all the relationships and makes people feel possessive. And then there's the problem of babies. It's basically the snake in the tree.
Alors, moi aussi, hein, comme Lauren, j'ai fait
Like
beaucoup de...
Lauren, I did a lot of research on communities, various ones, and in any case, every community, every sect, and I would even say every religion is built around sex. In other words, either it encourages it in a permissive, libertine way, like the community that I imagined, or the Tamara community in Portugal, or on the contrary, they are built around the refusal or rejection of sex, as in convents, or the fear of sex, the fear of seduction. We see this in Christianism, in Islam, and Judaism. We see that everything that aims to make the woman less desirable by veiling her hair or cloistering her, every community is built either against the refusal or fear of sex, or on the contrary, in the idea that we will reach an ideal society by refusing sexual or romantic possession. But in reality, we see that that doesn't work. We see that every community that tried to put in place erotic or loving relationships that are free or freer ultimately fall apart after a few years. I don't know if that answers your question, Katie.
No, I mean, it does, because one thing that I felt was so profound in your book was the way sex was positioned as a way to unlock or access a more deeper human connection. And so often sexual desire was kind of a gateway to appreciating people, as whole people, deserving of respect and sort of a different type of love. And I don't get the sense in at least American culture that we often appreciate sexual desire's capacity to do that. Another, we can talk about that, or we can move on. Whatever people would prefer.
Je serais bien en peine de comparer.
It would be very difficult for me to compare how romantic relationships are experienced in Europe and in the United States. However, as far as what concerns me, in all my books, it's very important to me to have erotic scenes because in general, I find them unsatisfactory in other people's books, not in yours, Lawrence. I often find them to be too sweet, full of cliches, and I try to create erotic scenes that are sometimes poetic, sometimes comical. In any case, I try to make sure that they're not conventional and are not cliched, and that's really important to me. There are sex scenes in Arcadia, but in all my books, even if they're a little disturbing, as is probably the scene where Farah is deflowered by a man who's 50 when she's 15. I knew I would have outraged reactions from readers, but that was something that I absolutely wanted to write.
Your sex scenes are wonderful, and they're hard to do. So I agree with you. I will never write another book that doesn't have a sex scene in it. And I partially, this is one of the things that I'm opposing in our culture, right? The disgust that certain people have towards sex scenes when sex is really a conversation without sometimes words, sometimes with words. But in conversations, things go wrong. They're sometimes horrible, right? They're sometimes like so embarrassing. And it's often for me, this stance against I guess Puritanism. I mean, we are a profoundly Puritan place, and there are many people who, if they come across a sex scene in a literary novel, will throw that novel across the room, and I find that so stupid and counter to the fact that we are all animals, right? Humans pretend that we're not, but we are animals. We do animal things, and one of those animal things is having a great deal of sex.
Par ailleurs, je suis désolée, j'ai l'air
I should also add, I'm sorry, I seem like a sexually obsessed person, which is not the case. But for me, other people's sexuality is an infinite source of reflection and surprise. Sometimes it's science fiction. If you start focusing on the preferences, orientations, practices that are not our own, from a novelistic point of view, it's absolutely fascinating.
Yes, this is great. And I have more questions, but I feel like maybe we want to turn it over to some of the audience questions. How does that sound?
Oui.
Because closing on the sex topic is that was really fascinating and great. And I feel also breaking, like you heard it here first, Lauren Groff will never write another novel that does not have a sex scene. But I'm going to ask you, we have one question from Elizabeth who says, is there a quality in the French language itself with its masculine and feminine parts of speech that influences the way you believe that a mother tongue can partially prejudice a reading of individual gender assignment for actual individuals?
Vous voulez dire préjugés?
You mean prejudices? That's a difficult thing for me to answer you about, since the only language I practice and intimately understand is French. So I don't really know what to say to you. Is it a language that is ultimately a macho language? It is a Latin language, yes, but it's hard for me to make the comparison. I don't know English and Italian well enough, which are the other languages I practice a little, to answer you. But clearly there are some languages that are more or less macho.
That is such a profound question, right? And I think it would need a linguist who has done a PhD on it to answer it in full. I am right now in Italy. I do speak French. I don't see a difference in how it affects, the genders of the nouns affects the thinking of the people. Primarily because English does not ostensibly have the same genderizing of nouns, and yet at the same time, our language is far from being, utopian. Right? It's very, very gendered. I'm thinking right now of a seatbelt, and the two parts of the seatbelt they call the one that takes things the female part of the seatbelt, right? I mean, it's like as though other ways to do things. So every language reflects the thinking of the people that made the language collectively. But every society that I have discovered is misogynistic. So I think we're going to find it in every language.
Thank you. We also have a question from Fabula, who asks, we can see parallels with the current situation with the pandemic and lockdown. A lot of people have left big cities to live in the countryside and experiment new lives more connected to nature. And she wants to know if either of you could comment on this parallel.
I can. Yeah, so this was my first impulse when the pandemic hit, right? I was living in Florida, which is not a place you want to be living in when the apocalypse hits. There are a lot of reasons why not. So after 2 months, I just packed my children up and took off on these deserted highways, right? There were no cars on these highways, and went all the way up to my parents' farm in the middle of nowhere in New Hampshire, where I basically lived in the woods for 5 months with my children. And every night I'd say a litany of the things that we had that could make us survive the apocalypse, right? There's a pond for water. My dad had a stint as a hunter, and so we had guns if we needed them. It was a little bit insane, but it was also extraordinarily comforting to think that, if we had to, we could possibly make it through a winter without external food, right? We could make our own food or enough food. And I have done some work looking at survivalists. I went to a survivalist camp once that was absolutely terrifying. And I think that it's very much on the same spectrum, right? Utopianism, survivalism, they're the same song sung in different voices.
J'ai écrit Arcadie avant.
I wrote Arcadia before the epidemic, before the lockdown, but I already had the feeling, as I was telling you, that nature was something I missed, and confinement was really hard for us because we live in an apartment, in a housing block, in a very urban situation, and that just made my desire for nature greater. And what I was saying about education earlier, I think it's criminal to raise children without there having a link with nature. You can raise them in the city, but they should definitely have a constant, reiterated connection with animals, trees, flowers. And the recent epidemic only convinced me of this idea that children that we raise in cities suffer from sensorial deprivation, and I think the damages will be terrible. So what I wrote about Farah only seems more pertinent to me today.
And the damage is not only on the children themselves, it's on the world too, right? Because if people are not directly involved in understanding the nature around them, they're going to think in a human-centric way, right? The Anthropocene only exists or because people believe that we are the center of the universe, right? But as soon as you start to spend a great deal of time in nature, you do see the interconnectedness of everything, and how we're not separate, we're part of it. And there's a lack of respect. I would agree entirely with you about the educational issue. I've tried very hard to make sure my kids know what different trees are, for instance, and what they can use from the trees, right? And to get them to work in the gardens and to understand how to grow things. And so I'm 100% with you on that.
Yeah, it strikes me that something that becomes sort of a false Arcadia in both of these books is are drugs, because they cloud reality and they make you withdraw from the world that you should be connecting to and engaging with. And I actually wonder if either of you were thinking about drugs as kind of like a faux or like a bad version of Arcadia, or a bad expression of that impulse.
This is why you're such a brilliant critic, Katie. You see things in books that are possibly were definitely there, but may not be consciously put into them. Like it's so yeah, that's exactly right. I think mostly the drugs are in my book because they were in all of the 60s and 70s.
Better explanation, yes.
A lot of drugs, it just happened. But you're absolutely correct, and it's not just in utopian communities. It's the way that we deal with television, right? Television's a drug, or wine, which I love.
Yes.
But it dulls you and it keeps you from fully engaging in the world.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be too down on narcotic pursuit. Like, that's great, but it's just not going to make everything perfect in the way that you sometimes hope that glass of wine will make everything perfect.
No, it makes everything worse.
We have a question from Chloe, which says, is environmentalism its own religion, or has it become one? And are either of your novels maybe warning us against that tendency?
Allez-y, Emmanuelle.
Oui, merci. Alors, non, en ce qui me concerne.
No, as far as it concerns me, that wasn't my ambition at all, to write a thesis novel with a message that would warn us about the dangers of environmentalism. It's true that in my novel, there's a lot of irony about vegetarians, vegans, anti-speciesists, but I have both irony and a lot of sympathy for them. I don't know if it's becoming a religion. I think that in any case, in our lives, there are many things that are related to obsession, ritual, cult. Anything can become a religion, absolutely anything at all.
I don't think it's a religion either. I think it should be a religion, to be honest. It seems much more helpful to have a religion that exists in order to preserve the world and the creatures in it. So I'd be all for it. I wouldn't be, I would pay my dues. I probably wouldn't go to the mass all that often, but
I think that might be all the time we have, but this has been so wonderful. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Katie. Your questions were excellent.
Oh, ouais. Merci Lorraine, merci.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Violaine and Nicholas. Yes, also, and Louise. Thank you, really.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much again, Lauren, Emmanuelle, Cathy, and also our wonderful interpreters, Violaine Tourny and Nicolas Elliott. So Emmanuelle's book has been first published in French by Edition POL and is now available in the US at Seven Stories Press, translated by Ruth Diver. And Lauren Books is also available in French, translated by Karine Chichereau, and in English, so at Plomb and Hachette Books. So if you want to buy these books, please be in touch with the Albertine Bookstore team. Yeah, just want to add that a recording of this discussion will be also available online on our website. So thank you again for being here today. And the next event of our series Ideas and Ideals will take place in September and will celebrate Simone de Beauvoir and feature the feminist philosopher Manon Garcia. Thank you. Bye.